Understanding how those two lines are essentially the same thing is the key to playing bebop. What's up, everyone? Thanks for tuning in this week. Today we are digging into enclosures. Now, this is a bit of a response video to actually one of my own posts. Every other week when I don't post a long form sort of lesson video, I post a short that covers like a single concept in a bite-sized fashion. And over the winter, I posted one that was all about enclosures. It outlines some of the exercises I like to do for myself and with my students in a very short way. It got quite a few views and quite a few comments and questions and all that kind of stuff, so I thought it might be a worthwhile concept to dig into a little more in depth, and that's what we are going to do today. So if you are a practicing improviser, you have probably heard this term of an enclosure, and you probably even have maybe a vague sense or maybe a detailed sense about what it is. However, I think it's one of the more challenging concepts to move from sort of like, hey, I understand this and I maybe have a few exercises that I practice and know that kind of stuff, moving it into your playing. That is really where the rub is with this, and I think sometimes it can be a little tricky because there is a lot of variation with this particular idea. So today we'll cover not only like what is an enclosure, what are the different options, that type of thing, where does this different sort of variation come from, but also help give you some ways to actually practice this and take it from like, oh, I've got this exercise in front of me, to actually getting it in your playing and hopefully helping you understand why I said that first little idea I played is essentially the same whether I'm playing a quarter note line or a relatively intricate eighth note line. All right, let's get into it with our first concept here. So before we even get to an enclosure, we really want to know about what an approach note is. All of these things we're going to talk about today are just ways of ornamenting lines that are primarily chord tones. So the first step to that is just approaching a chord tone either above or below. Say my given chord tone is an F natural. I could approach it below by a half step or a whole step, or above by a half or a whole step. And either way could be fine. It depends on the context you're playing in, it depends on the sound you want, it depends on the player. Everybody plays this sort of stuff a little bit differently. The most common way that I like to have students practice this is just meat and potatoes arpeggios. So if you're working on your arpeggios, rather than playing just in like straight up quarter notes, I really love to have people do them as eighth notes, so it's a rhythm that's a little more like we might actually use when we improvise, but approach that first note that we're going to play with an approach note. In this case, I'm going to go a half step below. Not only does that give us a little bit more idiomatic line to something we might actually use when we improvise, but it also gets us thinking about, okay, my target note in this case is an F, and then how do I get into that target note? I don't even care if that approach note is in the chord, out of the chord. It's all about what leads me to that F natural or whatever the given chord tone is. So that's a great way to get started with this, but if you want to move this into a more all-encompassing way of practicing this sort of concept of ornamenting chord tones, there's a few exercises that I think are really useful and also are things that people actually play. They're part of the jazz language. So what we're going to do, we're going to start out by taking just a triad, an F major triad in this case, and we're going to play it in sort of an alternating pattern. Now that's not necessarily super interesting. So what we're going to do is we're going to add an approach note before each one of those. Now in the example, I've labeled them as either red or blue. The approach notes are red, the chord tones are blue. This is a very typical sounding idea, and by alternating where we are in the triad, we get just an interesting line. That's what we get with these alternating directions of the triad where we're skipping over a note. What if we just took them all in the same direction and we did just a half step below each note? That one we just played was a diatonic note, so we're all like in F major there, but what if we did it with a half step below each note this time? That's another kind of interesting sounding idea. And the point of me presenting those two ones back to back like that is not to say you have to practice every single one of these. It's actually to drive home the point that there are a million variations with this. And you could find a bunch of other videos online of people showing you different enclosure exercises. I don't know that it's so important you master every single one of them. It's all about the concept. So pull some of the ones that I show you today. If you have other ones that you'd like to practice, check those out. But make sure that you're thinking about the concept of I'm on a non-chord tone and then I resolve to a chord tone. Don't just play it like it's an exercise out of like the Arbin book or something like that. That's not really going to do anything for you or help you get into your playing. It's all about taking a very foundational approach to thinking about, can I think simultaneously about non-chord tones and chord tones to turn it all into this, I would say, somewhat intricate melodic line. Cool, that's our starting point. That's the approach note. That is the most basic form of this ornamentation. So what we're really talking about today is enclosures. So we can kind of break this into two categories. We've got 2-note enclosures and we have 3-note enclosures. So a 2-note enclosure has 2 non-chord tones before we resolve to the eventual chord tone. Just like with our approach notes, we could be above, we could be below. They could be by half steps, they could be by whole steps, they could be diatonic notes, they could be non-diatonic notes. Again, the variations don't matter so much. You got to know what your ear gravitates towards, maybe what the players that you really enjoy. When you transcribe them, check out what they do with this concept and be like, oh, well, they tended to do this pattern. For example, this next one we're going to look at, I like to be a diatonic note above and then a half step below. So the note above is always in the scale and then the note below is always a half step, whether it's in the scale or not. That exercise, super meat and potatoes. And actually, I would say if you have one to take away from today, it would either be that one or maybe the next one I'm going to show you with also 2-note enclosures. So basically what I'm doing, like I said, when I'm ascending, I'm above by a diatonic note and below by a half step. So for our first target note, I'm just doing the triad. I'm not even thinking about the 7th chord here. It's an F major chord. So my target note is F. I'm above on a G and then below on an E natural because I'm a whole step and then a half step. Now the E natural happens to be in the scale, but that's not what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking it's below a half step. My next chord tone would be an A natural because I'm just going right up the arpeggio. So my note that's above that diatonically to F is a B flat, and then a half step below, in this case, would be a G sharp. And then I just continue that ascending. Now when I descend, I switch my pattern. I went below by a half step, above by a diatonic note, and then resolved. Super foundational exercise. If you haven't worked on this stuff at all, that's where I would start. Just working on triads, major and minor, doing these basic type of enclosures. Now, if you want to take it a step further and take this 2-note idea into something that is maybe a little bit more idiomatic to what people play when they use this concept or how they connect ideas, check this one out. So here, I did the exact same type of enclosure where I was above by a whole step, below by a half step, but instead of starting on those non-chord tones, I started on the chord tone. So for the first one, I started on the root, and above and below, then back to the root. Then I jump to the next chord tone. In this case, it's going to be the major third. And so on and so forth, up the chord, and then descending, I do the same thing where I start below, go above, and so on and so forth with those non-chord tones. All right, let's move to the 3-note enclosure. This one I think is maybe the most like bebop sounding. You'll hear this all over the place in playing of Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, all these type of players. And instead of just 2 non-chord tones, we're going to have 3 non-chord tones. And this usually ends up being 2 half steps above and then 1 below, or the opposite, where we have 1 half step above and then 2 half steps below. This one is by far the most intricate and in some ways the most difficult one to master, especially as you're going between major chords and minor chords and that type of stuff. There's some real variation that needs to occur here in order to accommodate when you want to be a half step above, and then 2 below, or vice versa. So let's look at it on a major chord just to sort of break it down a little bit so we can figure out what's going on. Before we dissect this, I would also add that the articulation is incredibly important on this. You heard there was a little bit of accent in certain places on this. That's really what makes it sound like bebop. So make sure you're not just sort of like playing this as an exercise that has no musicality. That's not going to get you there in the same way. All right, the key thing to understand this bit of ornamentation is understanding when to be above by a half step and then have your 2 half steps below, or when to be above by a whole step and then have that 1 half step below. So our first note is the F concert. So we could do really either there because there's either a whole or a half step above that note, but I chose to do the whole step because that's what my ear liked. But you could totally do the half step above. Both would sound great. Now, the really key place to understand is what happens on the next note. It is an A natural. So if we're thinking in the key of B flat, there is a half step above that note. There's a B flat above that note if we want to stay in the key. So that one really needs to be the half step above and then 2 half steps below. Now, I would argue the reason I like the opposite pattern on the first note is because then you get this variation. Like, to me, that just sounds interesting. That's a nice sounding line. Now, you listen to different players, they may play it differently. So again, don't get too bogged down in the absolute specifics of it. Decide what you like sounds the best, maybe is informed by the people you listen to, and then run with that to help you ingrain that concept. Now, the rest of the line just shakes out in the same way. I've got a C natural as my next chord tone. It could be a half step above or a half step below. I chose to go, a whole step above, or 2 half steps above and a half step below. I chose to go with that option, and then I did the same thing on the high F. All right, that is a lot of technical nuts and bolts with this stuff. Let's talk about actually employing this as an improviser. One of the places I like to practice this kind of stuff and work on it with students is on tunes that have long chunks of chords, because it's a little easier to sort of like work it out a little bit when you've got maybe 4 or 8 bars of the same chord. So the examples are going to come from the tune Little Sunflower, Freddie Hubbard tune. We're going to look at both the A sections, which are in D minor, and the bridge, which is E flat major 7 to D major 7. So the first step with these would maybe just to like compose some preconceived lines that use enclosures that you could apply on the tune that you're working on. Once you have some of these preconceived ideas you like, you're going to take one and you're going to cram it into your solo. You're going to decide a place where you want to apply it and then improvise around that. So just to show you an example, I'm going to play the first 8 bars, so the first A section. I'm going to improvise a little bit up top. I already decided I'm going to play this at the beginning of the second phrase. So in bar 5, essentially, I'm going to plug in that last 8th note line. I'm probably going to wait a little bit before I get there just to make sure I'm in the right place. So I'm going to play a little bit and there'll be a little bit of a pause in my playing, and I'm going to plug it in and then try to finish off the line in hopefully a musical fashion, just to get used to what it feels like to play these sort of things and what it sounds like to play these lines. All right, that is step number 1. Step number 2 on trying to get this into your playing would be to take some of the exercises that we practiced and move them into your playing in at least a somewhat musical fashion. You're still really going to want to focus on applying the concept. In this case, we're going to do 2-note enclosures, but really trying to do it in a little more musical way rather than just running the exercise. So before you do that, you might just want to touch base. Hey, do I actually know the ones that I need for this tune? So we're going to go to the bridge of this tune, which, like I said, is an E flat major 7 chord to D major 7. So if I'm playing E flat and D, I'd want to check my 2-note enclosure patterns. Once I feel confident about those, I'm going to move them into the tune, again, in a somewhat musical fashion, not just an exercise. Then finally from there, I would start to try to apply these a little more freely. Again, thinking about like, what's my main concept? Am I mostly focusing on 2-note enclosures? Am I mostly focusing on approach notes? Am I focusing on those 3-note enclosures that are a little more complicated? Maybe keying in on one of those things as the main thing I'm going to work on, but trying to apply them in a much more improvised, much more organic fashion. In all honesty, that means you're probably going to play less of them. When you do an exercise and you try to apply it and you're just trying to work on that exercise, you're really trying to like force the exercise in, so you're going to play a lot. But when you actually improvise with these, only a couple enclosures might happen in a little phrase, and that's fine. They're not going to be the main thing that you play in your lines. They're sort of connecting material. They're the thes, the ands, the buts, the howevers of your playing. You need them to make the language function in an eloquent way, but they're not actually the main ideas, and that's really important to remember. So let's just see how this would sound on the B section. I'm going to kind of apply those mostly two notes, I should say. I might do a couple of approach notes or maybe even some 3-note enclosures in there through one chunk of the B section. Cool. That is a lot of information and a lot of very technical information. To really get these under your fingers, you have to have sort of a good command of arpeggios, a good command of being able to think outside of the arpeggios and then getting back to them, and then also the ability to sort of like extend these concepts into music. Any of those places can be potential stumbling blocks. So if you feel like any of those is difficult, you might need to firm up your arpeggio knowledge a little bit. You might need to firm up your mode or scale knowledge so you know like, okay, well, I'm playing an E chord. Do I really know E major really well to know like the different notes that I can choose from for my enclosures? Or maybe if you're trying to apply it and you're struggling a little bit, maybe you haven't practiced those foundational things enough in order to apply it. So very tricky concept. Like I said, lots of variation. Don't get bogged down in the little differences. Try to focus on the concepts and see what this can do with you. It's absolutely crucial to being a confident bebop and change player. So invest some time and see what you can get going with this concept. All right, we'll see you in the woodshed.